The New Hope Research Facility, or falsely rebranded as the more palatable New Hope Wellness Center for those not granted full access to the facility's darker details, is undoubtedly one of the most critical institutions in all of Sera's history. Established by the Coalition of Ordered Governments in 50 BE, during the height of the Pendulum Wars, New Hope was never meant to serve the public any good. Its creation wasn't about wellness, it was about containment, and research that went far beyond the parameters of just fighting and winning the Pendulum Wars. On paper, the facility was built to study the effects of disease on the human body, specifically, conditions emerging among workers exposed to Imulsion. But the true purpose ran much deeper. Imulsion itself was the lifeblood of the war. The glittering prize both the COG and UIR sent millions to die for, a near limitless energy source. It fueled machines, economies, and egos alike, but it also poisoned those who mined it. The same substance driving Sera's future was quietly killing the very people extracting it. If the public ever learned that Imulsion was just as lethal as the war being fought over it, that revelation could shatter morale, disrupt recruitment, and collapse the already fragile support of the Coalition's war machine. After all, many gears as it stood were disillusioned, believing the war itself was being fought for freedom and democracy, not over an energy source. So instead of honesty, the COG chose silence. Instead of treatment, they chose experimentation. To preserve secrecy, the Department of Health and Welfare, typically responsible for civilian care, ambulance services, and public health, was handed control of New Hope's foundation. Under a veil of benevolence, they were given unprecedented freedom to operate beyond oversight, cloaked by classified mandates and buried beneath layers of institutional lies. And for a project like this, they needed a place no one would look. That place was the Kadar Valley, an isolated stretch of land in northern Tyrus. Wrapped around Mount Kadar, it was the tallest and most remote peak on the entire planet. The environment was rugged, barren, and cut off from civilization. It was the perfect hiding place for what the Coalition didn't want the world to see. Under the quiet direction of the Coalition's then Chairman Monroe, New Hope was built not as a sanctuary but as a vault, a place to bury the truth, along with anyone who might stumble too close to it. In the unlikely event someone ever did stumble upon it, the facility was constructed to have a mask ready. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a remote freight hub, officially branded as the Jameson Shipping Depot. The illusion was quite meticulous. Everything from the outside, the design, the building's overall layout, all resembled a quiet, nondescript structure tucked away in the wilderness that could easily deflect any curiosity. And to the untrained eye, it was just another cog in the machine of wartime logistics, so the remoteness of such a facility wouldn't be questioned. And for a time, that illusion did hold. Perhaps it could have held forever if the facility had simply stopped there, if the research had remained inside its concrete walls, if what they were doing hadn't begun to spiral beyond their own control. But the truth about New Hope was never meant to stay buried, because what they were building beneath that fake depot wasn't just knowledge, it was something far more dangerous, something alive, something that'll come back years later and push humanity to the brink of extinction.
Welcome to Jameson Depot. Proper identification is required for entry. I'm sorry, but proper identification is required for entry. Good day.
As the Pendulum Wars dragged on, so too did the evolution of New Hope's mission. What began as a facility for treating exposed miners slowly, quietly shifted its focus. The patients were no longer the laborers themselves, but their children. Infants born with fragile lungs, malformed limbs, and unexplainable cellular mutations. The damage wrought by Imulsion was no longer just environmental, it was becoming hereditary. And the COG needed someone willing to confront that horror without flinching. After a long and meticulous vetting process, one name rose to the top: Dr. Niles Samson. On paper, Samson was a model candidate. He was patriotic, composed, and unnervingly brilliant. He held advanced degrees in medical genetics and specialized in teratology, which was the scientific study of the causes, mechanisms, and patterns of abnormal development in living organisms, with a focus on congenital birth defects, Teratology specifically investigates how environmental, chemical, and biological factors can disrupt normal development during embryonic or fetal stages, leading to malformations, growth retardation, functional disorders, or even death. That alone made Niles qualified, but his degrees went much further, including immunology, the study of the body's immune system, including its structure, function, and how it protects against disease. Toxicology, the study of harmful effects of chemical, physical, or biological agents on living organisms and the environment. Pathology, which was a branch of medical science that studies the causes, nature, and effects of diseases themselves. That involves examining tissues, organs, bodily fluids, and autopsies to diagnose and understand diseases. And finally, virology, the scientific study of viruses and virus-like agents, encompassing the structure, replication, interaction with host organisms, and role in causing disease. Normally, that branch of study also includes developing methods of preventing, diagnosing, and treating viral infections. By all accounts, Niles Samson was a walking institution unto himself, and by all fields of his study, could easily oversee everything and micromanage the facility if need be. Aside from his intellectual qualifications, which was undoubtedly quite numerous, there was other major contributions Niles Samson had already given to the COG. During the height of the war, Samson's work earned him a place of distinction within the COG's Department of Health, where he became a prominent figure in Tyrus' scientific community. But his greatest honor came in the form of silence. Recognizing his value and his discretion, COG High Command granted Samson clearance to Azura, a classified island stronghold designed as both a haven for the elite and a vault for scientific preservation should civilization ever fall. Within Azura's secure laboratories, Samson helped shape the early foundation of what the Coalition saw as a future beyond global collapse. His voice was broadcasted across the island in public announcements, described as sterile, soothing, and instructive. He became a symbol of calm, order, and intellectual pride. To his peers, Samson was a paragon of reason, but to the COG, his true worth lay in something darker, his ability to bury truth beneath layers of protocol. Meanwhile, far from Azura's sterile comforts, Imulsion miners and their families were succumbing to a fatal respiratory illness the COG was deeming Rustlung. Exposure to Imulsion fumes caused irreparable damage to the lungs and nervous system. Worse still, it was manifesting in their children born with congenital deformities and organ failures. The implications were devastating. Imulsion wasn't just poisoning workers, it was corrupting life itself. And yet, rather than disclose this to the public, Chairman Monroe doubled down on secrecy. With the Coalition's economic dominance rooted in control of Imulsion reserves, acknowledging the fuel's toxicity would threaten everything: public trust, political stability, and COG supremacy over Sarah. So, the Department of Health quietly authorized the expansion of New Hope. The facility would now treat and study the afflicted children under the guise of finding a cure. And, with his proven loyalty, scientific expertise, and willingness to operate in the shadows, as shown with his time in Azura, the Department of Health and Wellness officially appointed Niles Samson as director of the New Hope Research Facility. The children would arrive in silence, their parents would never hear from them again, and Niles, he would go to work. Now, in the beginning, Niles Samson did believe he was saving lives. That doesn't make him innocent, it doesn't make him right, but it does make the truth harder to swallow in some respects, as it does give us a timeline of the man's mental descent. In his earliest logs, there's a note of conviction, twisted but undeniably sincere. He often cited the mission of New Hope as righteous, even noble, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. In one of his personal entries, he wrote, "Save the children." That's what they always say. In this case, we're truly doing it, or at least we are giving it our very best shot. Was it delusion? A lie to keep his team motivated, or was it propaganda? Repeated just enough to convince himself. Perhaps it was all three. But whatever it was, Niles did believe in the work. Now, it's worth pausing here to acknowledge one of the earliest surviving patient logs from New Hope, because buried within it, there is a trace of something that would soon vanish forever, and that was Niles' restraint. As an example, Ruth was a 15-year-old girl. Niles' reports on her mentions her joints being so inflamed she couldn't sleep through the night without crying out in pain. Her behavior had become erratic and unpredictable over time, likely the result of neurological distress. Thanks to the constant administering of Imulsion directly into her bloodstream, Over time, her breathing is documented as becoming labored, her eyes growing discolored, and her fingernails growing too fast, while her hair barely grew at all. And yet, Niles noted her symptoms with something resembling concern. It wasn't the same cold distance he had when writing about later patients. For Ruth, he even wrote about finding medication to ease her suffering, as long as it didn't interfere with the research. That last part mattered most. The study always came first. It was undeniably his priority, as morally gray and unethical as it might be to experiment on children. Still, in that early report, Ruth had a name, an age, a file that documented her as a person, with an intent to help her to somewhat become comfortable, whatever that meant. And that alone made her one of the lucky ones, because she would be the last referred to as a person, where ease of suffering was at the very least taken into consideration. Now we'll come back to the other subjects later. For now, the focus remains on Niles, and the unraveling of a man who began with purpose and ended in the pursuit of something that no longer resembled humanity or a drive to cure the sick. His pursuit, quite literally and figuratively, became mutated over time. Now, New Hope was never a wellness center, and the staff knew that. There was no illusions here, not among the doctors, not among the researchers. The facility wasn't built for comfort or for healing, it was built for control, containment, concealment, and study. Behind its locked doors were prison cells lazily disguised as hospital rooms to lure the test subjects into false senses of security. Operating tables that would later double as autopsy slabs. Observation decks where mirrored glass separated the researchers from the people they were slowly killing. And a morgue expected to be used sparsely out of the natural degradation of one's body due to Rustlung. But all of it would quickly ramp up alongside the research's intensity. The subjects, of course, were children. Dozens of them. Some were teenagers who still remembered home. Others barely able to speak because they were so young. Most of them were sick, already showing signs of congenital Rustlung or related degeneration. All of them were exposed to Imulsion in some way, shape, or form, and so they were written off as appropriate test subjects that were daily injected with the various doses of Imulsion. Their reactions were cataloged like variables in a spreadsheet. If a child screamed for too long after an injection, their vocal strain was noted. If their skin broke into lesions, the surface area was recorded. If they stopped eating or moving or speaking, the data was marked, never questioned. Their pain was never really treated, it was just purely measured. The original goal, at least on paper, was always medical. To trace the hereditary impact of Rustlung and to find a cure. To find a way to halt or reverse its effects, maybe even, as I said, develop a long-term solution. But the goal fractured fast. Because the longer Niles watched these children unravel, the more the mission began to twist. It stopped being about saving them, and the project became something else entirely. A study of biological failure. Niles wanted to see how long the human body could endure torment before it collapsed. What would deform first? Lungs, liver, or spine? What pain could a nervous system sustain before it blinked out entirely? And beneath that brutality was a darker curiosity. What if anything could adapt? Most of the children, unfortunately, didn't stand a chance. Their organs liquefied, their bones thinned and shattered. Immune systems flatlined. Some clawed at their own skin in the final stages, others simply wasted away, lungs filling with fluid, eyes wide with confusion. But occasionally something didn't die. A cell would resist, twist, not toward recovery, but toward some type of mutation. For a few hours, maybe even a day, that child might display elevated strength, unnatural reflexes, or heightened awareness, before succumbing to seizures, cardiac arrest, or total system collapse. Even these moments of resistance ended in pure agony. But to Niles, those were the breakthroughs, the moments that pushed the research and the drive for something further. He stopped seeing these outcomes as failures, and to him, the Imulsion wasn't a threat anymore, it was potential, a catalyst. Each twisted strand of DNA was a whisper of evolution. Each death was data, a sacrifice in service of progress. He stopped logging treatment and started purely logging transformation. The distinction between healing and tampering completely vanished. He was no longer trying to cure these children, he was trying to reshape them. The air in the labs, over time, also grew colder than the morgue. The cries of the children were muffled behind reinforced walls and eventually behind code names. Files were updated, names redacted, birth dates erased. They were no longer patients, they were specimens, trials, experiments, and in some cases flat-out prisoners. And Niles, he, like much of the staff, stopped seeing them as children altogether. And you could argue that change in perception was all thanks to one patient in particular, subject EV184-9. Eventually, she would be known by a name, Myrrah. Unlike most test subjects, Myrrah wasn't under Niles Samson's direct supervision. She had been assigned to the care, if one can call it that, of his lead geneticist, a Dr. Torres. But that distinction would soon become irrelevant because everything about Myrrah defied what the facility understood about biology, Imulsion, and the limits of human life. While Niles continued cataloging the destructive effects of Imulsion, cell distress, breakdowns, neural collapse, he also noted rare cases of point mutation, brief, flickering anomalies that he considered beneficial in contrast to the overwhelming pattern of degradation. But where other subjects exhibited these effects for minutes, Myrrah did not degrade at all. She had been brought to New Hope under the same assumption as the other children, a child likely afflicted with early-stage Rustlung. But the moment Imulsion entered her system and she fell under intense observation from the staff, it was clear Myrrah didn't weaken. It didn't affect her at all. In fact, some even argued that she stabilized, and then she improved. After a number of tests proving that Imulsion didn't affect her, out of morbid curiosity and desperate to confirm what they were really seeing here, Dr. Torres and Niles began pushing the limits of what Myrrah's body can really sustain. They injected Myrrah with dosages of concentrated Imulsion that had been proven lethal in other trials, amounts that had killed children in hours, sometimes minutes. But even in these lethal concentrated doses, Myrrah remained untouched. There was no deterioration, no visible stress, nothing. In fact, the opposite. Dr. Torres observed cellular regeneration, not just resistance, but repair. Her cells recovered faster than baseline. Mitochondrial activity increased. Aging slowed. Based on lab readings, her biological clock appeared to function at roughly 50% the normal rate of a normal child. She wasn't just immune, she was evolving thanks to Imulsion. And that's when Niles began to take a deeper interest in evolution. Beyond her medical anomaly, Myrrah was something else entirely. Something rare inside New Hope. A child who still had hope. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she in fact cooperated. She believed she was helping. Myrrah had been told she was special, that her blood might save the other children, that her daily medicine, which was actually raw, unfiltered Imulsion, was part of a cure. She believed the doctors when they said she was doing something good, and so she smiled when she was injecting. She even thanked them. She wanted to help. Niles documented her traits in glowing terms: selfless, nurturing, sacrificial. A child who understood what was at stake and gave freely, unknowingly, for the cause. And over time, that perception twisted into something far more dangerous. Niles wasn't just studying her, he was beginning to believe in her. To ensure continuous observation, Niles had Myrrah moved out of the standard holding wards and into a private, furnished room at the center of New Hope's observation wing, complete with a two-way mirror. She became the facility's nucleus, the quiet miracle the rest of the research orbited around. She was still just a little girl, but to Niles, she was the key to everything. Her immunity didn't just offer an answer, it offered a form of belief, a validation that mutation could be controlled, replicated. If Myrrah could survive, and even thrive, on what had killed hundreds, then others can too. At least that's what Niles told himself. With every new test on Myrrah, the scope of experimentation expanded across the entire facility. Her survival gave Niles justification to push harder, to raise the dosages, to extend exposure windows, to accelerate trials on other children. Because Myrrah could handle it, then maybe they can too. And if they couldn't, then they simply weren't the answer he was looking for. And with the children no longer logged under names, but just subjects and numbers, them perishing just made it all the more easier to mark it down as data and move on to the next child. Dozens more children would perish because of Niles Samson's dangerous belief that Myrrah's immunity could be replicated, reproduced, or artificially forced into others. Her survival wasn't a cause for caution, it was a green light. And in pursuit of that breakthrough, the experiments intensified. But the illusion of progress didn't last. The breaking point came with a subject known only as RK619-4. This child had initially shown promise, early-stage cellular enhancement, increased resilience, nearly mirroring Myrrah's biological response to Imulsion. For a brief time, it seemed the anomaly could be recreated, but within 18 hours of what Niles called a quote-unquote final transformation, RK-619-4's body collapsed violently. The death was swift, brutal, and final. In his final log about the subject, Niles wrote, "It's time to face a hard truth. EV-184-9, which was Myrrah, response to Imulsion exposure may be entirely anomalous. And Dr. Torres has just informed me that her T cells appear to be particularly responsive. He believes her body is now aging at a pace roughly half that of a normal girl." It was the first time Niles formally acknowledged what should have been obvious all along. Myrrah was not the blueprint. She was the exception. But instead of slowing down, he redirected. If Myrrah was a singularity, then perhaps the flaw wasn't in the methods, but in the subjects. Maybe the problem wasn't in trying to replicate her, maybe it was that humanity itself had reached its biological ceiling. And that's when Niles made the next leap. If the evolution he was chasing couldn't be found within the boundaries of human DNA, perhaps it was buried deeper, beneath the surface of the world itself. He turned his attention to the Hollow, Sarah's vast subterranean domain, home to countless indigenous life forms, creatures that had lived side by side with Imulsion for generations, inhaling its fumes, feeding near its sources, nesting in it. And yet none of them showed any signs of cellular damage, no Rustlung, no birth defects, no mutation whatsoever. They had adapted to Imulsion, or worse, they had never needed to. Where the surface population was crumbling, the Hollow endured. Niles took this as a sign. He theorized that the true path forward wasn't simply human evolution through Imulsion, it was human evolution rewritten with non-human DNA as the bridge and Imulsion as the amplifier. Not a cure, but a complete transformation, a rebirth, one that would no longer resemble humanity at all, at least none of humanity's weaker aspects. And so the experiments changed again. The injections became way more invasive than ever before. The cross-species trials began. He started combining human samples with tissues from hollow creatures, seeking compatibility, seeking resilience, seeking the unnatural fusion that would give birth to something new. In his mind, Myrrah had opened that door. But what Niles stepped through wasn't salvation, it was pure, utter descent.
I ask you, how else do we secure our future? What is a culture without hope? Good empirical scientific research is the foundation of any civilized society. We'd be savages without it. Filthy savages.
It was during a deep field expedition that Dr. Niles Samson first laid eyes on the creatures of the Hollow, native organisms thriving beneath the surface of Sarah. These beasts lived in constant exposure to Imulsion. They breathed its vapors, bathed in its runoff, and yet displayed no signs of cellular damage. No Rustlung, no cancer, no deformity. For Niles, who had watched child after child die in agony under far lesser exposure, it was a revelation. These creatures hadn't just resisted Imulsion, they had survived it. This discovery reframed everything. Myrrah had proven that mutation could be inherited, but these hollow species proved that resilience could be native, and perhaps if spliced correctly, it could be transferred. So Niles pivoted. If he couldn't replicate Myrrah through human trials, then maybe the answer wasn't in humanity at all. Maybe the next step was to force evolution, to create it through genetic fusion. He began extracting tissue samples from hollow beasts, mapping their unique DNA, and conducting a new wave of experimentation. The method was invasive, irreversible. He began splicing non-human DNA into the remaining children at New Hope, and what followed was monstrous. The subjects responded violently. Their bodies mutated beyond recognition. Spines contorted, jaws expanded, muscle mass ballooned. Skin thickened into armored ridges. Bone erupted through flesh in places it just didn't belong. Their minds degraded just as quickly. Reason collapsed into rage. Motor skills devolved into primal violence. They screamed, snapped, attacked the walls, and each other. The staff gave them names. Sires. They were the worst kept secret in New Hope. A grotesque consequence of a natural ambition. The sires were sterile, volatile, and mentally broken. Some couldn't even recognize their own reflections. Others became obsessively fixated on lights, sounds, or voices they just couldn't place. Some mimicked human speech, mangled and slurred, echoing back the last words they heard before their minds failed altogether. And all of them had once been children. They were locked in reinforced cells, too dangerous to study up close, but far too valuable to terminate. Their presence was a silent warning. This is what happens when you try to control evolution. Among them, though, one did stand out, a subject known only as Patient Zero. His designation was enigmatic. Some believed he was the first child ever brought to New Hope as the original Rustlung case. Others theorized he earned his title because he was the first to undergo full-scale gene splicing with hollow DNA. His origin, unfortunately though, was buried in redacted logs and scrubbed data. What did remain of his records painted a disturbing portrait. Unlike the other children, Patient Zero survived. His body didn't reject the fusion, it welcomed it. He displayed rapid tissue regeneration, increased stamina, even enhanced cognitive response for time. In many ways, his profile mirrored Myrrah's. Slowed aging, stable mutation, enhanced immune response. He was a massive breakthrough. To Niles, Patient Zero proved that Myrrah wasn't a divine accident, she was a precedent. Proof that the fusion of non-human DNA and Imulsion could create something better. And yet, the truth wasn't that simple. Because despite his regenerative abilities, Patient Zero's Rustlung did persist. The condition didn't spread as rapidly, but didn't fade entirely either. It lived inside him, quiet, lingering. And then his body began to change. Over time, he started to physically resemble the hollow creatures he had been fused with. His limbs grew uneven. His posture twisted. His skeletal structure changed. He no longer looked like a child, he looked like something caught halfway between species, between intentions. He was alive, stable, powerful, but he was no longer human. But to Niles, that wasn't failure, that was success. Because in his eyes, Patient Zero was the prototype, the first confirmed subject to bridge the biological gap between surface and hollow, between decay and adaptation, between humanity and something else. To Niles Samson, Patient Zero offered something the other Sires couldn't: clarity. Not just physical ability or regenerative resilience, but something far more dangerous: awareness. Where other Sires were wild, erratic, and barely sentient, Patient Zero was calculating. He was sadistic, yes, but lucid. Where others clawed blindly at the walls, Patient Zero watched. He learned. And over time, he began to mirror the very cruelty of the staff that had made him. Niles once noted in a sealed log that Patient Zero understood pain, not just as a sensation, but as a tool. And for Niles, that changed everything. Because if this creature, this fusion of hollow DNA, Imulsion exposure, and human trauma could not only survive but think and choose, then perhaps that was the future he'd be chasing all along. It was around this time that Niles gave Patient Zero a new designation, one spoken in hushed tones in later years: Ukon. As the faculty continued to run tests on Ukon, it was clear his transformation was much more impressive than initially thought. His resilience now was unlike anything New Hope had seen. When exposed to Imulsion, his body didn't just endure, it completely repaired. Bullet wounds closed within minutes. Lacerations would heal instantly without a trace of any damaged tissue. His regenerative ability was so potent that the staff quietly deemed him as immortal, and opted to develop a chemical suppressant known as cyostatic gas, which was designed solely to shut down his healing in case containment failed. But what truly unsettled them wasn't his recovery, it really was his awareness. Ukon didn't just simply survive, he observed, he calculated, and Niles saw in him the end of an idea, and the beginning of another one. Rustlung was now no longer the focus. In Ukon, Samson found something more valuable: a template. A vision of human evolution shaped not by medicine but by design. He began reimagining the future. Not a healed population, but a remade one, stronger, sharper, born in the lab, not in the womb. This was no longer about stopping a disease, it was about building something that could thrive in a world that disease had created. And the line was finally irrevocably crossed. But not everyone at New Hope followed Niles over that line. The Sires had already begun attacking staff with alarming frequency. Not officially confirmed to be in random bursts or in targeted ones, but It was undeniable that scientists were maimed, others vanished. Niles brushed it off as a cost of progress, but the staff knew better. The screams in the halls weren't accidents. They were proof that the experiment had spiraled out of control, and Ukon was watching it all. As the children continued to die and the survivors were twisted into monsters, a portion of the staff began to unravel. Many had joined New Hope with the belief that they were working to cure Rustlung. Now they were presiding over the torture of children and the birthing of abominations. And with that realization came something Niles feared most: dissent. Some resigned in secret. Others tried to go to the public. Leaks began to surface, whispers of what New Hope was really doing, behind locked steel doors and multi-level clearance protocols, classified files, genetic trials, children treated like livestock. The outside world hadn't yet seen the full horror, but the scent of rot was already leaking through the cracks. And Niles responded in the only way he knew how. He tightened the noose. Surveillance at the facility increased tenfold. Cameras were installed in every single hallway. Mail was screened down to the envelope fibers. Armed guards were tripled. Audits of staff behavior became routine, clinical, brutal. It was no longer a research center, it was a fortress built to contain the guilt. And among the guards was a man named Private Sid Redburn. Young, loyal, believing in the cause. He had volunteered for New Hope believing he was doing something noble, protecting scientists as they sought a cure for a devastating disease. What he found instead broke him. In a personal letter to a family friend, Colonel Tolman, Redburn described what he witnessed inside of those walls. It was worse than anything he had ever imagined. He'd been ordered to shackle 6 children to bed frames, not to protect them, but to restrain them like animals. He described holding down toddlers and preteens, some too weak to resist, while men in white coats plunged needles into their veins or filled them with glowing yellow syringes of Imulsion. When the samples were taken, the children were often just left on the floor, shivering and ignored. One boy pleaded to be untied. A girl cried until she vomited, but the staff was instructed to just collect the data, not to comfort, ignore them. Redburn's letter begged Tolman to contact the chairman. He wrote that Dr. Samson had gone mad, and that New Hope was no longer about medicine, it was about madness disguised as science. His desperation and his pleas for help, unfortunately, would fall on deaf ears because the letter never made it out of the facility. Niles intercepted it in the mailroom, and to him, it was clear that Redburn's loyalty had become a liability. Niles marked Redburn as a security risk and was quietly discharged. But before he was removed, Redburn did one last thing. He stole a file. A classified data pack detailing Samson's research, patient logs, and early notes on Patient Zero's transformation into the thing that would later be referred to as Ukon. It was a risk that could have cost him his life, but somehow he got out. Redburn smuggled the file across borders and hid it deep within an abandoned outpost in Winlock, Vasgar, which at the time was a neutral country untouched by the politics of the Pendulum Wars. He had hoped it would remain safe there as a last-ditch act of defiance, a record of what New Hope had become. Not a cure center, not a wellness facility, but a crime scene sealed with government funding and scientific delusion. On the surface, it seemed like justice had finally caught up to the monsters behind New Hope. The leaks, the resignations, the whispers of experimentation on children. It all eventually reached the highest levels of government, and when it did, Chairman Monroe acted swiftly. He couldn't afford a scandal of this magnitude, not on his watch. Not when the cog was already cracking under the pressure of global war and growing unrest among its people, so he buried it. Officially, Monroe issued Sovereign Directive 10345. A sweeping mandate that called for the immediate shutdown of the New Hope research facility, effective immediately. All operations were to cease, all programs terminated, and the directive, publicly, to an extent anyways, condemned Dr. Niles Samson and his staff, labeling their work as a gross violation of ethical and humanitarian standards. Their research was deemed unauthorized, and their methods barbaric. And worst of all, their victims were children. The directive went further. It ordered all New Hope personnel to report to the House of Sovereigns in Ephyra for trial. They would be held accountable for what the directive described as imprisonment, torture, and unauthorized experimentation on civilian minors. A scathing line in the Order named Samson and his team is a stain on the soul of the Coalition, accusing them not only of conducting atrocities, but of actively concealing them, spinning lies, forging reports, and silencing dissent to keep the truth buried beneath the surface. It was, on paper, a rare act of political accountability. The COG had turned inward, admitting a horrific failure and promising justice, but it was a lie, because New Hope wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.
Did they know what was awaiting them inside Mount Kadar? Did they deserve what we did to them? Should we be punished?
Chairman Monroe may have believed in the righteousness of his directive, the full shutdown of New Hope, the public condemnation of its staff, and the promise of justice, but not everyone in the COG government shared that conviction. As the facility was being shuttered and its personnel prepared for trial, a different voice within the Coalition quietly emerged, a fringe political faction embedded deep within the upper echelons of the COG, completely unaffiliated with Monroe, made its move. They didn't care for ethics or image or accountability. What they saw in Niles Samson wasn't a war criminal, it was an asset. To them, his vision wasn't madness, it was strategy. Niles' work on genetically enhanced soldiers, his twisted attempt at evolution, wasn't something to bury, it was something to weaponize. These officials believed Sarah's only true path to peace was COG dominance, and the fastest way to end the pendulum wars was through superior engineered biology. So they approached Niles in secret and offered him what the chairman had just stripped away: protection, funding, and freedom. The only catch was secrecy. Monroe had spies in every department. If this new operation was to survive, it needed to vanish, not just from the public, but from the Coalition itself. And so Niles agreed. He accepted their offer without hesitation. His work would continue, but underground, beneath the ruins of a condemned facility now marked as closed off to the entire world. But to protect what remained of New Hope, Niles turned the site into a fortress. The original walls were reinforced with multi-layered security systems. Automated turrets, surveillance nodes, and heavy blast doors sealed most corridors. But even that wasn't enough. What he needed was a presence, something that could monitor, assess, and react. So he created one. Using fragments of his own personality and cognitive modeling, Niles constructed an artificial intelligence, a digital overseer, tasked with managing the facility in his absence. The AI was more than a passive watchdog. It could observe visitors, respond to spoken prompts, deny access to restricted areas, and execute defensive protocols in case of breach. Its logic core was designed to only recognize those with the highest clearance, Niles' own clearance. But it didn't stop at just surveillance. The stasis tanks, deep within the facility housing the remaining sires, were wired directly into the AI's command system. If intruders ever breached the inner vaults, the AI could awaken the sires, unleashing them as a last line of defense. They would not be controlled, only pointed in a direction and left to do what they were engineered for: unfiltered aggression. Even Niles, in one of his final logs, admitted a strange discomfort with the system. He felt this primitive AI construct was a synthetic reflection of himself that lacked refinement, empathy, or the ability to question its orders. But time was undeniably running out, and in the end, there was no one left to question his choices. But let's make this clear: New Hope didn't die. It simply changed masks. And beneath that mask, the experiments continued. The secrecy now wasn't just Niles Samson's burden though, it belonged to everyone. The quiet architects of this cover-up, nestled high in the ranks of the COG's fractured government, were willing to do whatever it took to keep their new plan alive. And that meant building something darker, colder, and deeper than anything that had come before. Their chosen place was beneath Mount Kadar, a harsh, snow-drowned mountain range far removed from the rest of Sarah. There, the next phase of experimentation would unfold. Buried so deep that even Chairman Monroe's sweeping reforms would never reach it. But before any research could begin, a laboratory had to be built. And to build it, they needed a mining crew. So they turned to the Nethercut Mining Corporation, contracting its laborers under the guise of high-priority wartime excavation. The miners never knew what they were digging. They asked no questions, they just worked. Through the stone, through the ice, through days and nights that blurred together in the dim glow of headlamps and floodlights. Some spoke of strange smells in the mountains, of deep groans in the earth. Some wondered why the excavation was so urgent, why the structure's foundation needed to be sealed so perfectly. But they were just miners, and when their job was done, they were silenced, permanently. Not reassigned, not paid off, lined up in the cold, and executed. Most of them never saw it coming. Others begged. Some fought. A few tried to run, but it didn't matter. None of them left that mountain alive. Their bodies were buried with the same urgency as the lab they built, and to the outside world, they simply vanished. For the families they left behind, the explanations were cruel in their emptiness. Their disappearance was described as mining accidents, cave-ins, miscommunications during wartime. But for one reason or another, whenever someone asked if they could retrieve their loved ones' bodies, they were all met with the same response. It was too dangerous. It was too big of a risk to recover the bodies, too unstable to send a rescue team. The COG's fringe loyalists called it damage control. But to those who knew even fragments of the truth, it was murder made official policy. These were innocent miners that were just killed simply for knowing that there was even a lab there. But while the snow settled over fresh graves no one would ever visit, something else was happening. Not far from there, but under the same veil of silence. From the dying halls of New Hope, Niles' chosen began their march. Myrrah, Ukon, the surviving sires, the most important ones anyways, dozens of encrypted research logs, sensitive samples, surgical equipment, hard drives filled with decades of dark science, a handful of scientists still loyal to the mission. They didn't travel by convoy or air transport. That was too loud, too visible, and it would have given Chairman Monroe a trail to zero in on. So instead they walked, through the biting cold, through storm and sleet, over frost-covered ridges and between collapsed highways. They moved at night, wearing civilian coats over blood-stained lab gear. Some carried sedated sires and wheeled containment units. Others hauled cases of raw emulsion and spliced tissue across the snow. And in the center of it all was a child being escorted in silence. Myrrah, still smiling, still trusting, still unaware of the role she was being shaped to play. In hindsight, it wasn't much of a relocation, it was more akin to a pilgrimage, a final push by those who had long since crossed the line between reason and fanaticism. And so they disappeared into the mountains, into the dark. What rose from that mountain would not resemble medicine, it would not resemble humanity, but it would be remembered. At the Mount Kadar facility, there were no oversight committees, no ethics panels, no more chairmen to answer to. Here, Niles Samson was free. Free to create, free to destroy, and free to decide for himself where the lines of science ended and madness really began. And that first step was with Myrrah. She had long since ceased being a patient. Now, she was his protege, his partner. Raised under his watch, modeled in his image, she was praised, groomed, and isolated from the truth of what he was becoming. In time, he no longer saw her as a child or a subject, but as his own creation, the key to everything. The experiments at Kadar shifted to one goal: create a new species. Niles and his remaining scientists began with what they had: sire DNA and human embryonic stem cells. The goal was to hybridize a viable creature, something stronger than humans, resistant to emulsion, yet capable of reproduction. But their early attempts were grotesque failures. The hybrids were malformed, stillborn, or died moments after birth. Some lived long enough to scream, others never drew breath. Each failed experiment left the lab soaked in the stench of chemical preservatives and scorched flesh. Eventually the team grew desperate, and so they turned to Myrrah herself. As she matured into adolescence, Samson extracted her embryonic stem cells. Cells that carried the very anomaly he had once sworn to study, not to exploit. This time, they fused Myrrah's genetic material with sire DNA. The result was unprecedented. What would be identified as subject UL-119-2 was created, or officially known as the Matriarch. She lived, she matured, and most importantly, she was able to reproduce. The Matriarch's womb marked the beginning of something monstrous. From her, the first generation of what the scientists would come to call the Locusts was born. Their name wasn't poetic, it was prophetic. Like the insect plagues of old, these hybrids were feared for their potential to spread uncontrollable death, devouring everything in their path. Engineered from emulsion, sire DNA, and Myrrah's embryonic stem cells, the Locusts were unnatural by design, but singular in purpose. They were soldiers, obedient, evolving, and deeply connected to one another in ways the scientists couldn't fully understand or explain yet. As time went on and testing continued, that connection would later be referred to as the hive mind. It was more than just instinct more than a military protocol hardwired into their brains. It was a psychomagnetic field that bound every Locust to both the Matriarch and Myrrah herself. The key really was in Myrrah's biology. Her unique temporal lobe, mutated by Imulsion exposure from birth, acted like an antenna, receiving and transmitting thought across the Locust consciousness. Without her, the Locust became erratic, unguided, unable to learn or adapt. But under her watch, they grew smarter, faster, stronger. To strengthen this link between Myrrah and the Locust, Dr. Torres designed a containment module to preserve the Matriarch in cryptochromic fluid while connecting her biologically to Myrrah. A brain-computer interface was installed to amplify said connection, sending neural feedback directly into Myrrah's mind. And when she entered the device, her control over the Locust magnified. Commands became instinctual, obedience absolute. It was an unimaginable, resounding success. A new species was engineered, one that could reproduce, and more importantly, one that could be controlled. But as we'll see, this level of control and intense connection between Myrrah and the Locust would become a double-edged sword and the very thing that'll doom humanity. But we'll come back to that in a second. While Dr. Torres slaved at strengthening the connection between Myrrah and the Locust, the rest of the staff continued to breed and grow thousands of Locusts within the facility. Some were kept in cages, others in stasis tanks, with more tests being ran. Niles Samson wasn't content with simply creating a brand new species. He wanted a weapon that could survive anything. So now he was beginning to introduce other genetic material from various creatures, embedding within the Locust the ability to hibernate, adapt, and evolve across generations of warfare. They weren't meant to be just soldiers, they were going to be his defining legacy. A legacy that appeared to be molded and heavily influenced by the seemingly endless warfare given to humanity via the Pendulum Wars. And with the idea of breeding these soldiers came the realization that they needed to communicate. So they were taught. Exogram boards initially used in ape intelligence studies were repurposed for Locust instruction. Over time, the Locust began to speak. At first, only single words, and then a few phrases, but those with the strongest link to Myrrah developed fluent speech in Tyrant. The more Myrrah evolved, the more they did too. And it goes without saying, as the experiments grew more intense, so did the moral rot. And just when you thought the ethics and morality surrounding this couldn't get any worse, it did. Among the scientists, Dr. Torres was unique. He had known Myrrah the longest, originally assigned to her under the false pretense of quote-unquote treatment at New Hope. He had once called her his patient. In truth, she was his test subject. And yet somehow over the years, that dynamic had changed. Eventually, the two of them became lovers. It was a relationship twisted by power imbalance, by manipulation, by decades of exploitation disguised as mentorship. But Niles didn't care about ethics anymore. That had long been thrown out the window. So he allowed the relationship between Dr. Torres and Myrrah to continue, justifying it as a means to an end. Because if Myrrah could produce a child through natural reproduction, that child might be an even greater anomaly than Myrrah herself. And that was the prize Samson had his eyes on, the potential child Myrrah would have. The union between Dr. Torres and Myrrah would finally conceive a daughter, recorded as Subject TE-872-3, otherwise known as Reyna. She had a traditional human birth, but nothing about Reyna was ordinary. It was confirmed that she carried Myrrah's telepathic abilities, decelerated aging, and enhanced immunity, all without genetic splicing. So to Niles, she was a miracle of biology, a perfect test subject. To Torres, she was his daughter, and that altered his position in his work here. The same man who had once watched children injected, mutated, and discarded without blinking at New Hope, now panicked at the thought of Reyna being subjected to the same fate. The irony was staggering. He had once treated children as tools. Now, faced with losing his own, he finally understood the price. So Torres ran. He smuggled Reyna out of the facility, disappearing into the wilds of Sarah. Samson, caught off guard, failed to stop him. Enraged, he turned to the one person who might pursue them, Myrrah. But rather than send her after them, Niles did something that might have been worse. He lied. He told Myrrah her daughter had died during a failed containment breach, that there was no body to recover, no ashes or body parts to mourn. It was a manipulation born out of desperation, If she ever found out the truth, Niles knew everything he built would collapse, so the lies piled higher. That lie was meant to preserve everything, but it became the very thing that destroyed all of it. Niles Samson had underestimated many things before, but nothing would prove more fatal than underestimating a mother's grief. He thought Myrrah would mourn and move on from Reyna, that her sense of duty to science would eclipse whatever bond she may have felt toward her newborn daughter. But Niles had grown blind in his obsession, failing to understand the very subject he'd raised like a daughter and weaponized like a tool. Reyna's supposed death broke Myrrah in a way no experiment had ever done so before. Myrrah fell silent, withdrawn. The young woman who had once smiled at white coats and quietly thanked them for her daily medicine of raw emulsion vanished. In her place stood someone colder, still, watching. Her warmth toward the staff dissolved. Her trust evaporated. She no longer saw herself as human because the people around her never did. What the staff didn't realize was Myrrah wasn't alone in her pain. In her grief, Myrrah connected more deeply with the Locusts than ever before. They were like her, chained, tested, caged, observed. She saw Ukan still locked away in the background, once mindless, now growing sharper by the day. The telepathic connection they shared began to evolve, and soon, Myrrah could feel more than just their presence. She could feel their resentment, their unity, their desire for freedom. And for the first time, she understood them, because now she too felt trapped. And it was around this time that containment chamber, built to strengthen her link to the Matriarch, and by extension, the Locust, had done more than the scientists could have anticipated. It didn't just create a feedback loop of control. For Myrrah, it created empathy. Myrrah's pain bled into the hive mind, and from it, the Locusts awakened. Niles noticed the change immediately. In his logs, he confessed that Myrrah's emotional withdrawal was jeopardizing the objectivity of the research. He restricted her access to the Matriarch, but by then it was far too late. The exposure had already done its work. The Locusts were no longer mindless subjects, they were listening. Ukan, thanks to his retained cognition and his shared link with Myrrah, began absorbing Samson's research through her. Everything from New Hope to Kadar, emulsion theories, genome maps, teratogenic models flooded into his awareness. He didn't need to be taught anything because he learned instantly, like a virus consuming code. And worse, the others began to change too. Unlike the sires before them, whose only language was pure, unfiltered aggression, the Locusts started showing restraint. They ducked under cover during tests, avoided unnecessary conflict, showed signs of strategic behavior, even self-preservation. It was subtle at first, easy to ignore, until it wasn't. Then came the murmurs. Dr. Van Neal was the first to report it. Quiet sounds coming from the cell blocks. Not growls, not screams, whispers. At first they seemed like gibberish, but then the patterns emerged, and it looked to the scientists as if the Locusts were chanting. Some huddled in clusters, others turned their heads simultaneously in the same direction, and when they spoke, it was almost always in unison. Not words of rebellion or violence, but something more akin to prayer, repetitive, low, and reverent, as if they weren't just connected to one another, but worshiping something or someone. The staff was put on high alert. In his final logged entry, Niles didn't hide his fear. He wrote that Myrrah's emotional contamination of the hive mind has introduced novel and unhelpful ideas. It was the first time he acknowledged that they may not be in control anymore, that what they'd created had taken on a mind and a will of its own, and he expressed genuine concern for everyone's safety. But by then it was far too late. The Queen had mourned, the hive had listened, and the fire had already started beneath the surface.
They do not understand. They do not know why we wage this war, why we cannot stop, will not stop, why we will fight and fight and fight until we win or we die.
United in grief, driven by wrath, Myrrah's transformation had finally reached its end. The Locusts were no longer subjects of study or strands of manipulated DNA. They were hers, not in theory or biology, but in soul. Their blood ran with her pain. Their minds echoed her sorrow. She no longer pitied them as victims of science. She loved them as a mother would love her own, and they responded in kind. The creatures she once sketched in private became her chosen family, while the researchers who fed her raw emulsion and called it medicine became strangers to her. The death of Reyna, the lie that shattered her, had done more than break Myrrah. It had stripped her of any illusion that she was ever one of them. She no longer saw herself as human. She denounced the species that had imprisoned her, lied to her, manipulated her, and ultimately caused the death of her one and only child, and carved an entire army from her flesh. She wasn't their patient, she wasn't their test subject, she was something else entirely now. Even as Niles tried to limit Myrrah's exposure to the Matriarch, it had proven already too late. The connection between them had grown into something deeper, something he couldn't measure or restrain. The hive mind didn't just respond to Myrrah's commands, it pulsed in time with her thoughts, mirrored her grief, and stirred when she suffered. The Locusts began to change. What had once been test subjects, sedated, restrained, cataloged, started to move with purpose. They were no longer twitching anomalies and tanks. They stood, waited, watched. They followed her. Myrrah came to also understand by now that it wasn't just a bond, it was her destiny. She wasn't just their genetic origin, she was their voice, their anchor, their queen. For every moment she had been used, imprisoned, or lied to, these creatures had endured worse. And in her, they found someone who saw them not as monsters but as children. And in them, she saw the family humanity had really stolen from her. And by the time anyone at Mount Kadar realized that, it was already too late. The revolt came without warning. Myrrah took full control. She moved through the facility like a storm, directing the Locusts with surgical fury. She taught them to pry open cages, to wield broken pipes and sharpened steel. They tore through guards, they tore through researchers. What was once a template of classified ambition became a slaughterhouse carved by vengeance. In this violent eruption, the COG's private security forces were deployed in desperation. They were fully armed, highly trained, but none of them were ready for what faced them. What stood in front of them now were not the mindless sires the COG remembered. The Locusts had learned. They moved in unison. They took cover, flanked, adapted, and overwhelmed. And as the guards fell, the Locusts claimed their weapons. Shotguns, rifles, ammunition. For the first time, they fought man with man's own tools, and they were winning. Somewhere in the middle of this chaos, Niles was mortally wounded by the very beings he obsessively created. Bleeding and broken, he somehow managed to crawl back to the only thing he had left, his control room. From there, he initiated two final measures. First, he created yet another AI construct of himself. This was meant to be an echo to remain behind, to tend to the facility in whatever state remained after the Purge. The Purge was the final measure. With shaky hands, he triggered this final protocol. It was a cryogenic wave that was meant to sweep over the entire facility. Sub-zero gas roared through the vents. It swept through the halls, froze computers mid-process, and suffocated screams mid-breath. It was meant to trap all of them, staff and locusts alike, sealing away the shame of Mount Kadar forever. But it wasn't enough. Myrrah and her children did manage to escape. Slipping through collapsing tunnels and frost-laced corridors, they fled into the deepest, coldest veins of Mount Kadar. The Coalition would never see them again, at least not in this form. It was from there, beneath the ice, locked away in the mountain, the Locusts would go on to build something new, Nexus. A kingdom not of science or subjugation, but of identity, of power, of unity. There were no cages, no researchers, no chains. Myrrah no longer sought the COG's guidance or recognition because they had called her defective. They had mutilated her bloodline, but in doing so, they at least gave her an army. And so, to her, only the Locusts had ever been worthy of her love, and they would build. But back in the dead halls of Kadar, the only thing that remained was the artificial ghost of Niles Samson. He wandered the empty facility like a priest in a frozen crypt, tending to ruined specimens and corrupted data. He waited for someone, anyone, to return, but nothing ever came. Because what the COG had buried in the dark didn't die, and instead endured. It evolved, and it remembered. And it would come back with a vengeance within less than a decade, and reclaim the entire surface of Sarah for themselves.